This is a video looking at the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson in depth. Now, of the poems in the AQA Power and Conflict collection, I think at times Charge of the Light Brigade is one of the most difficult to write about at a more advanced level. But we can find our ways into it. It is obviously a quite straightforward poem in many ways. Tennyson himself said he wrote it in 10 minutes. But it does have certain ideas underneath it. I'm not a fan of it as a poem, but I think it's very useful potentially in comparison to others. Now let's start with the things that it know about the poem. First of all, it's important to understand what the Charge of the Light Brigade was. It is an incredibly famous event, even if you've not heard of it, from the Crimean War of the 1850s. Total military disaster. There's actually a very good sketch in Horrible Histories on the background of it and what led to it being such a disaster, which is worth checking out. Basically, the idea is they were sent completely in the wrong place, to the wrong place. They were meant to capture a small number of Russian guns, these cavalry, and they were sent into a valley with an entire army with cannons, and of course were massacred. This poem was written only 6 weeks after the event, so there's an element of propaganda to this to a degree. Taking something that could be seen as disheartening to the public and trying to turn it into something slightly more positive. As far as Tennyson goes, the reason he was writing it was because he was the poet laureate at the time. We still do have a poet laureate now, the official poet of Britain. So his poems generally had to support the establishment and their ideas here. But I think there's an interesting view here potentially. Tennyson took that and turned it into something that at least celebrated the everyday person. Now we come at them charging with sabres. They're long curved swords, particularly used by the cavalry, which, as said before, is soldiers on horses in battle at this time. So with that background information, let's make sure we're clear on how this is developed. We start with the idea that 600 soldiers are being told to charge for the guns and carry out orders. Okay, although we are informed it is a blunder. We'll come back to that, but the emphasis is very little on the blunder. They ride into the Valley of Death. Many are shot dead, especially by cannons. Some make it through and attack the gunners with their sabres. We're told how brave they were and that we should honour their glory. See, it's relatively straightforward, and it does work in that kind of clear, developed storytelling of off they go, or they're told to go, off they go. They are shot at, some get through, some come back, but not many. We should glory them. Now, if we take the title of the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, obviously it is just referring to the event, although again, giving it this title, The Charge of the Light Brigade, it basically originates from this poem. It's not obviously an official title for what happened, and you can see how that title kind of shifts the focus away from the mistakes, from the blunders, from the disaster of it all. It focuses already on the soldiers as heroic, charging into battle despite the difficult situation. The massacre of the Light Brigade would have been a very different thing. So I think it's very important to see that. The word charge obviously does come back as well in several times in the poem, but I think this idea that it's established from the beginning that this is about the Light Brigade themselves, that this is about their heroic actions rather than what mistakes were made. So if we deal with the first stanza, as with all of them, numbered very, very clearly. We start with these famous lines, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, which obviously, establish the pace and energy of the poem. They kind of imitate the riding of the cavalry into battle, and in an almost hyperbolic way, really. It makes it sound like they're coming. It always reminds me of them coming, like in a film. There is a very famous film made of the charge of the Light Brigade as well, but like in a film, them kind of hurtling towards the enemy. So yes, we have the imitation of like the horse's hooves in the movement of half a league, half a league, half a league. But I think at the same time it prepares us for the idea. This isn't really going to be realistic. It's going to be very much a celebration. Now, if we look at a couple of details from here, first of all, just down towards the end of this stanza, when we're told forward the Light Brigade charge for the guns, he said. This, like the word blundered in the next stanza, is an example of the pushing to the back of the people giving the orders, of the people who messed up. It just depersonalised as he. Who is this guy? Somebody who sent them the wrong way. We're not bothered about them. We're bothered about the 600. And here we get the first use of it that obviously ends every single stanza. And 600 is an interesting number in this case because it's big and it's small. Now, what I mean by that is, if we think about it, 600 people are obviously a large number of people. And bearing in mind not many come back, that is a disaster, tragedy of huge proportions. But in terms of an army, in terms of a battle, it's a small number. The fact we're later told they're attacking an army, 600 is nothing. And so again, at the same time as emphasising the tragedy through the huge number of them who are involved, and maybe even the bravery that this many people all act as one, we also get the sense of how the odds were against them. Now, that idea has been emphasised already further up with the repeated metaphor of the Valley of Death. Again, very hyperbolic. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the capitalising of death, again, gives us a sense that it's almost like death as a character is waiting there for them, and it being a valley, all around them, surrounding them. But this hyperbole, again, which develops later into the jaws of death and the mouth of hell, really gives us a sense of how far these people will go, how far these soldiers will go in order to fulfill their jobs, to do what they're asked to do. It's a real exaggeration of their heroism. As we move into the second stanza, this is where we deal with the order being given to them. Now, as we look at it, again, we have that word blundered I mentioned just now, which seems to underplay it a little bit, really. A blunder is a bit of a small word for something as awfully bad as this. But again, it's to deflect us to another way of looking at this, because then we get the triplet after this of led by the anaphora of theirs not to do this, theirs but to. What is their duty? What is their position? It repeats that because we're bothered about them, not the very, very vague someone. That's what he's doing here to us. And this triplet of not making reply, not reasoning why, but doing and dying, kind of sums up what he's seeing as the soldier's job. And the fact that they were led into this by incompetence, and all they did was exactly as they were asked. That phrase, to do and die, which has become a very famous phrase since then, of course, uses that pairing of words to essentially prepare, along with Into the Valley of Death, which of course is straight underneath it again, to prepare us for the idea that they are aware that this might lead to their deaths, and yet they're still going to do it anyway. Now, once we get to the third stanza, we're really entering into the battle. And following on from this half a league, half a league, half a league, what we do and need to note that we get from Tennyson is an attempt to place us alongside the Light Brigade, these cavalry soldiers, as they go into battle. There's no realism here. I mean, there's no blood, there's no death. There's mention of jaws of death and everything, but there's no actual detail of anything like that. But we are in a kind of heroic, almost as a film-like sense, although not to Tennyson, of course, as he wouldn't have known what film was. In an almost film-like sense for us, we are placed alongside them, riding into battle ourselves. Again, the anaphora, the triplets of canon at the beginning, is particularly effective. I think, like theirs above, effective just as much in terms of its sound as its meaning. I mean, canon is not an onomatopoeic word, but it sounds like it. It does have a sense of imitating the sound of a cannon firing. So it does really kind of place it in there with right, left and front, all sides coming in. Cannon, 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 as though the shots are being fired at us. And to follow that up with volleying and thundering, two, again, hyperbolic verbs. But particularly I'd look at the idea of thunder, as though, you know, a storm is being raged down on them. And of course, that's the word that comes straight after it. They are stormed at. It makes it seem that what's coming at them is kind of thunder and lightning of all sides, bashing away at them, but with shot and shell. And of course, he uses the sibilants there, storming at them and shot and shell, to also imitate the sound of the cannonballs coming at them. But in contrast, we get the word boldly. So all this is happening to them. What do? They ride towards them, and they ride boldly, emphasising again very clearly it is about courage, heroism. And to take that further, the valley of death becomes the jaws of death and the mouth of hell. The personification turns into death as some kind of monster, and they are literally riding into its mouth, ready to be chomped up by death, ready to be swallowed up by hell. Again, hyperbole, 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 all the way through here, but deliberately to create a sense of the horror and danger. Stanza 4 is the longest, which deals with those who got through and passed the cannons actually attacking and fighting those with the guns. Now, there's a lot of use of language here, but also of juxtaposition to emphasise this sense of their heroism. Flashed at the beginning, going with the swords. I'm just going to stick with the swords for a minute here. Flashed, again, not a particularly violent word. Again, quite a romantically heroic word, if you like, for the sabres moving in the air, flashing, flashing all the way around as they turn in the air. And then later on, further down, you see I've identified the sibilants again, that imitates the sound of these sabres flashing through the air, sabre strokes shattered and sundered. Again, we're there, we're hearing the sound of them doing this, but he's not presented as anything particularly violent or dangerous. Sunder, you know, does give us a sense of cutting and cutting something in half, but still, it's not really a sense that they're actually doing anything nasty to the opposition here. The opposition, who are, of course, in the background. They're an army, they're gunners, they're Cossack and Russian. They're not really significant. Then we get a couple of examples of juxtaposition. Now, I particularly highlighted here sabring the gunners, which creates that contrast of, you know, using a sword on people with guns, which, you know, alternatively sounds ridiculous and a stupid thing to do, but again can also be seen as intensely heroic, and the extent of the fight that they were having to put up here. Charging an army does a similar thing underneath, actually. The sense again of how ridiculous that sounds, the idea of there's an entire army in front of you and you charge at them. But again, it's there to show the heroism, because by this point, that's what we're focused on. And also plunging into the battery smoke, the smoke that is rising from the firing of the guns, which of course will be blocking them from seeing what's on the other side, and we're given the sense that they plunge right in. Again, another example of a verb that's hyperbolic in its and gives us a sense of just how little they worry about what's coming. And to add to the overall sense of hyperbole, while all the world wondered, he throws in, I mean, complete rubbish, of course. The world isn't wondering at all about this tiny little battle, but it's trying to suggest, I suppose, how significant this actually not very significant action is. So the fight in general, when you see here, is emphasises a fight against the odds. There's no doubt about it. That's what he's really trying to say. And then the conclusion that they broke through the line is quite impressive. Really, really quite impressive. Unfortunately undercut at the end, of course, by the fact that when they rode back, it was not the 600. The first time we've changed from rode the 600. So, as the last ones go away, we once again have the cannon at the beginning. I mean, this is obviously a poem that deals in a huge amount of repetition, which I suppose deals with the repetition of the events. There's a lot of pairing as well, particularly, so it's well worth looking at that. Stanza 5 begins identically to stanza 3 until the 6th line, where boldly they rode and well has now turned to while horse and hero fell. Again, I suppose what we've got here is that the boldness of their attack has turned into the heroism of their unfortunate loss. And notice how the soldiers have become literally hero now. The name has changed. Pairing horse with it as well gives us again a sense of almost bravery in terms of the horses, but again maybe emphasising how little defence they had against these cannons. And then we come back to again the jaws of death and the mouth of hell, but the key thing to notice is, of course, the change is into the jaws of death came through the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell becomes back from the mouth of hell. Now, the idea of being able to come through death's jaws to come back from the mouth of hell is almost unthinkable. And that's what he wants to tell us. There may not be many of them, but some of them, the ones who did come back, wow, how did they manage that? Brings us to our conclusion at the end, when he literally starts to preach to us, really. The world wondered comes back, of course, but what's he telling us? Well, first of all, he hits these 3 big words: glory, honour, and noble. Glory, honour, nobility. This is him summing up what we need to look at. This was glorious what they did, okay? Not tragic, glorious. To see this extent of bravery from your fellow countrymen, glorious. And when he then follows it up, following the poetic O, which emphasises the emotion of what comes after it. Oh, the wild charge. Wild, I mean, could be seen as something, not particularly impressive here. It's a loss of control. But of course, it's that abandonment that goes with plunging forward, that goes with their boldness of riding, that really he's going for here. So he then begins in the second half of this stanza to order us to do this, honour them, give them honour, telling us at the end that this 600 are noble, the nobility that comes with what they've done. So if you think about the layout overall, as mentioned at the beginning, the poem is a narrative that follows the fight from the beginning through to the end, stage by stage. We have a narrator who obviously has never experienced war. Tennyson never fought in wars. So he is reporting what happened rather than being a part of it. It is almost like a reportage event here, like the modern day war journalists who go along with the army and don't take part but see what happens. But of course, he's not even doing that. He has no idea what happened at all, except from reports he gets back. The clear separation and numbering of the stanzas is something that I think is worth addressing here. It's almost like chapters in the story, I think, and I think that's possibly the reason why they're so clearly divided and separate from each other. They obviously have the same kind of pattern. They're all in two halves. The indentation of the lines after the first half and at the end of the stanza show you where those halves finish, but they're kind of irregular. Most of the time, you get 3 lines before the indented line, but occasionally odd ones are thrown in. Line 25 is an extra one. In stanza 4, line 30 seems like an extra one. So does line 35. And then in stanza 4, you've even got an extra couplet thrown in at the end. And in stanza 5, we get a double length second half to it. Now, in each of those cases, I think the only thing I would say is to consider the idea that adding in something to a regular pattern emphasises it. So think in each of those cases why at that point does either that particular line or that particular stanza or section of stanza need emphasis? And why at the end in stanza 6 does it then kind of more neatly come back to a couplet, a rhyming couplet at that, followed by the indented line? The repetition is obvious, but needs to be addressed as to why. The rhythm and rhyme are generally regular, even though the stanzas are irregular. And the point behind that is the pace and the energy that starts with half a league, half a league. It never lets up all the way through until I suppose arguably stanza 6 becomes a little bit more stately. So, what are the big ideas? Okay, we've got heroism. We've got a number of examples here that go with the idea of heroism, of what heroism is and why it's a good thing. So you can see by the extent of them how important this idea is. The use of that number, the hyperbolic metaphors, the maintaining of their discipline and focus, even despite the odds against them, the duty of the soldier, the emphasis of the heroism through verbs, the success they have despite the odds and the extent of their bravery. All of that puts together creates a picture of heroism. But what is just as interesting is in comparison to other examples in the anthology, where this is right next to exposure, and this picture of the life of a soldier does not fit in the slightest Owens in exposure. In fact, it's almost completely the opposite. And if you want to take soldiers in action as a comparison, then compare it to Bayonet Charge, where seeing it from the point of view of these heroes creates quite a different response for us. And of course, this is a war poem and creates a very clear contrast with most of the other war poems in here. Most of the other war poems, of course, are dealing with a more 20th century view of war. The earliest of them is the First World War. This is way back in the 19th century. We've got professional soldiers fighting. We've got we don't have any kind of media that gives us a sense of the war. We don't have any photography or the like that's giving us anything back. We just have these words. So we get a sense of what Tennyson wants us to feel being in a battle is like, and maybe it's it could be seen as fair enough that there is a great deal of this in it. It may be an incomplete picture, but there we are. We get the pace, we get the energy. I've not been in a battle myself, so I can't tell you. We're putting the battle alongside them. Do remember they are riding on horses as well. They're not creeping forward bit by bit with guns and hiding behind things. They're galloping at them. There's no personality or humanity given to the enemy. They're not important, something we see elsewhere as well. particularly in bayonet charge, that, and there's no detail of death or injury. So it's a very specific version of war, but it is one that places us alongside them, and more can be made of it. It's an interesting poem, not a great poem, but there are plenty of things that could be discussed. And I think actually, when you look at this in depth like this, it could be a very effective comparison to a number of more realistic war poems, because it allows you to get at the underlying idea of how people have seen and viewed war in the past and from a distance. And the conclusion here, which deals with glory and honour, it's a difficult one to compare to elsewhere because I'm not really sure how much glory and honour we get. It would be very interesting to compare with issues from Kamikaze, I would assume. But what we're trying to do at the end is think about the impact of an event like this. What does it mean to think about their glory and to honour people who do this? We could certainly think that Tennyson is concluding this for us by making us think, how do events like this affect us in a far-off war? What do they tell us about humanity?